I My name is Sierra Laverty. I'm the Horticulture Extension Educator here based in Boise, Idaho, here in Ada County. I've been working in the horticulture industry since I was a teenager and have loved learning about plants and how they interact with their environments ever since. I managed crews here at the Botanical Garden for many years, ran my own consulting business. And now I get to do pretty similar work here with Extension, and it's you are always learning new things, especially when it comes to trees. So this talk is about trees, how we can better support them in the urban environment. But looking at the benefits that trees provide, we know that they cool our streets and our homes, they clean our air of pollutants, and they mitigate stormwater, flooding, damage, things like that. But trees don't necessarily live very long in the urban environment, especially street trees. And a 2014 analysis that the USDA conducted looked at the mean life expectancy of street trees and found that it was somewhere between 20 to 30 years, which is a very short amount of time when we think about the general lifespan of trees. So this slide right here shows a few different trees. We've got red maple, let's say Norway spruce, and Oregon white oak. And in white, we have what that expected life expectancy looks like in comparison with their wild lifespan. So red maples can live 80 to 100 years in our eastern forests. Norway spruce can live 200 to 300 years in their native habitats in Europe, and Oregon white oak here in the Pacific Northwest can live up to 500 years. So we may not necessarily be using these trees as street trees, but we're using them in the urban environment. And what can we do to help them live as long of a life as they can? Because trees really provide the maximum benefits as they mature. And we call those benefits ecosystem services, all of the things that they do to improve the urban ecosystem, which is so different than our wild forests and natural areas where the trees may be native to. So let's learn a little bit about what we can do. So our learning objectives for today are to explain how planting depth affects tree longevity. So we're going to focus a lot on planting depth. That's going to be the big one here. We're also going to look at how other installation factors girdle trees or strangle trees. And then we're going to look at how all of these different problems combine to actually shorten the lifespan of trees in the urban environment and sort of what we can do to prevent that and prolong their life. So, most people, if you ask somebody on the street to draw you a picture of a tree and include a root system, that drawing might look a little something like this. Like a carrot stuck in the dirt with this long, deep taproot, and roots that don't branch out very far. But trees actually grow like this. They have wider, shallower root systems that actually provide them with better stability than that carrot in the dirt scenario. So most tree roots grow out 1 to 2 times, if not more, the height of the tree. So they're going out a long distance. And when we look at that and how that plays out um, along a suburban neighborhood, if we take this tree here, maybe this is a hackberry or something, we can look at how far out that root system of that tree really goes. So it can go all the way out into the lawn, all the way out into the streets, underneath sidewalks, underneath driveways, things like that. So they're going out a long ways. And there are a couple of areas we want to be aware of when we're thinking about either where to place a tree or if we're doing things like constructing a new patio or constructing a new sidewalk, driveway, etc. Sort of what areas are really sensitive around trees. So we have this area called the drip line, which is not an irrigation drip line. It's where water drips off of the canopy down to the ground. And beyond that, we have the critical root zone. And that's the area that we really want to focus on protecting during construction and just be mindful of sort of where that root zone is going to be as the tree grows. So you might plant a tree and it looks really small now, but keep in mind its mature size, the mature size of and diameter of that trunk, and then what that critical root zone is going to be. So that's the height of the canopy multiplied by 0.4. But let's zoom into what's actually happening here in the root system. We're going to dive in, magic school bus style, everybody aboard, jump in, and we're going to look at somewhere called the rhizosphere. So rhizo meaning root, sphere meaning area. So we're looking at that little tiny area around plant roots where water and nutrient uptake occurs, where plants foster beneficial um, microbial communities by doing something called releasing root exudates. So these are sugary, protein-rich, kind of sticky substances that actually go to attracting and feeding the soil microbes. So this area is really, really important and really critical, and we're learning more about the interactions that happen here every day. But for you to know, it's where water and nutrient uptake occurs and where plants are fostering relationships with the soil microbial community. Important place. And if we looked at that on a slide, so we might see a primary root jutting down and a lateral root extending out to explore the soil, mining it for water and nutrients. And all along that lateral root, we have little tiny, very small root hairs. Plants drink through their root hairs. So they are taking up most of the water and nutrients are being taken up by plant root hairs, not those lateral roots, not the primary root. Most of that interaction is happening at the root hair level. And these are nearly microscopic. They are so, so tiny. Some are microscopic. They serve to help anchor lateral roots, but a lot of the exchanges that are happening, the really, really important exchange of water, nutrients, etc., is happening at that root hair level. Now, what's really important for us to know as good stewards of trees in our communities is that root hairs need oxygen to grow. So soil oxygen promotes root hair growth. It also helps to promote a better microbial community. So our studies show that soil aeration or oxygen, it can support a more diverse set of microbes in the soil. So you have higher diversity of microbes, which makes it less likely that a pathogen, say like the various root rots that we have, Phytophthora cinnamomi, Phytophthora cactorum, they're less likely to be in abundance in the soil when we have this more diverse soil ecosystem. So aeration supports not only the root's ability to grow, those root hairs' ability to grow, but that stable microbial community. So two things that are really, really, really critical. And these root hairs are being produced by the million a day. So the plant is, these root hairs are constantly living and dying, being reproduced by the plant, growing and continuing on as the plant root system grows. But oxygen is a really critical piece to this process called respiration. So if you all take a big deep breath with me, in and out, you just participated in respiration, which is your body's ability to take the sugars and all this energy that it's gained through food and reserves, etc., and using it for processes in your body. Respiration is essentially sugar plus oxygen used as energy to conduct the plant's various functions that it's doing. One of those being the creation of and development of new root hairs in the plant root system. So it's a very important process that plants taking those sugars, important hard-earned sugars that it created through photosynthesis in the leaf tissue, sending those sugars down to the root system to be utilized in the production of new roots. Without oxygen, what we see is that root hairs struggle to develop, and the efficiency of that process, that water and nutrient uptake process, goes down. And this picture was taken here in the middle of the summertime. And of course, this tree is probably not going to make it. I need to go back and check on it, but it's probably not doing well with what you can see down there at the bottom. I'll go back here, which is, either an irrigation break or something like that happened. And we've got a really heavily saturated tree root system that's now growing crabgrass and other weeds better than it is growing trees. So we want to address those things, of course. We know that we don't want trees just standing in standing water. But what else can contribute to the lack of oxygen in soil for tree roots? Well, it turns out planting depth turns out to be extremely important. So that initial installation of the tree is a time when you can set it up for success, for long-term longevity, or you can try to set the tree up for failure. So there's been many, many different studies that have approached many different aspects of tree installation factors. This study was done by Clemson University and Bartlett tree experts, and they planted red maples and Yoshino cherry trees, and they planted some too deeply, and then they looked at how many of those trees survived over 2 to 3 years. So not a long study frame, but they did look to see what happened at different depths of planting and what happened after that. So when we look at the graph here on the right, we have a 50% reduction in tree survival. So 50% survival rate with trees that are planted both about 6 inches too deep and 12 inches too deep. When we look at the graph here on the left, what's going on here with this maple? It's interesting. Survival actually went up a little bit. As a reminder, this study was only done over a couple of years, right? So we weren't looking, 10, 15 years into the future, which is when planting depth issues can really start to be evident for a lot of different tree species. And the important thing here to note is that tree species are not created equal. They have different environmental preferences, susceptibilities, strengths and weaknesses, that sort of thing. So they're going to react differently and on different timelines to things like being planted too deeply. What they did find, though, with the red maple population that they were studying was that the trees that were planted 6 inches too deep had about 30% more stem girdling roots. So this root here that you see on the left here, wrapping around the tree's trunk, is considered a girdling or strangling root. So you may have heard of the term grafting before. Tree roots of the same species can graft onto one another, so they can effectively grow in and kind of merge together. Tree roots and tree trunks, the basically stem tissue and root tissue, don't graft together. So when a root wraps around that trunk tissue, as it continues to grow, it will compress that trunk tissue. And that's where all of the water and nutrient uptake system of the tree lies, is within that trunk, right? So as that compression occurs, it can actually start to reduce the ability of the tree to take up water and nutrients. So this study showed trees that were planted 6 inches too deeply, they had 30% more stem girdling roots, and trees that were planted 12 inches too deeply had about 50% more stem girdling roots. So significant increases in stem girdling roots or trunk girdling roots. So a more recent study on planting depth was done by Rich Hauer and Gary Johnson, and they looked at 400 trees 10 to 20 years after planting. So what happens when you plant trees about 4 inches too deeply um, uh, after, or four, well, I should say here, 1 to 3 centimeters, 4 to 6 centimeters, all the way up to 29 centimeters too deeply. So they had multiple different um, uh, soil grades of how deeply the trees were planted. And then they looked 10 to 20 years after planting. What they found is similar in that the deeper the tree is planted, the more encircling roots. So these are roots that are like threatening to become girdling roots. And the presence of stem girdling roots increases. So the deeper the tree is planted, the more likely you're going to see encircling and stem girdling roots. So as we zoom into the different tissues of a tree, um, you may know this already, and this may be brand new to you. So we've got bark here on the outside. We have the phloem that transports sugars. And then we have something called the cambium that essentially creates xylem and phloem cells. So it assists in the production of xylem and phloem cells that then have their two different jobs. The xylem being that important transport piece of water and nutrients, and then the heartwood interior to that. Now, it's important to note that there are some trees that can be more easily girdled, and we call those ring porous trees. So ash, redbud, oak, black locust, honey locust. Really only use a small portion of the outer xylem for water uptake. So that area is more those trees are more sensitive to things like girdling, especially when we're looking at things like borers, beetles, and things like that going in all the way into the xylem tissue and going and chewing out, boring out that tissue. So that compression again is going to occur on the phloem, maybe the cambium, and limit the uptake of sugars or the creation of those new xylem cells. And what this looks like when it gets really bad, I'm hoping you all can see this photo. It was having trouble loading with me earlier, but are SGRs or stem girdling roots that really can wrap all the way around a tree, causing it to decline or die. So right here, we've got a pretty major SGR and another one over here. We've got several encircling roots that really could have been removed at planting, actually could have been fully removed when the tree was initially installed, and unfortunately weren't in this case. So the other thing that I wanted to mention here is just the architecture of this root system here. We do have what's called a hinge right here. So this is an area where there's the root system kind of takes a turn and goes somewhere else, right? And when we look at tree architecture and stability, we want those hinge points far out from the trunk of the tree. We don't want them close in like this towards the center of the tree, because those hinge points become actually weak points where if the tree is being, say, blown over by some dynamic force like wind, it's being blown by really strong winds in a storm, those weak points can contribute to that general root system weakness there. So we've got another picture here of girdling roots. So we've got roots over here girdling. We've got a root here that either is maybe girdling, maybe just encircling here. And both of these trees have undergone what's called a root collar excavation. So where someone has taken usually something called an air spade that they can go through and using these jet pulses of air, remove the soil around the root system and kind of uncover what's going on there. So where the girdling roots may be, how deep the tree was planted, and you know, what might be able to be done about it. So that's called a root collar excavation. A study that just came out, this literature review done by Seattle Parks and University of Massachusetts, analyzed over 40 studies that looked at the effects of planting depth on the survival of urban trees and the stress or health of urban trees. And they found that deep planting, the burial of that root collar, was a primary contributing factor to stem girdling root formation. So the primary contributing factor is that deep burial of the root system. And stem girdling roots, like we've talked about, can cause compression of the woody and non-woody tissues in the stem, leading to physiological decline and structural instability, which doesn't sound great either. One thing that can happen when trees are planted too deeply is that they will actually create these roots that will try to go up in the soil, sort of where there's uh, possibly where there's better oxygen levels. And again, it's going to create, because of that angle of incline, it's going to create that hinge point again closer into the trunk of the tree, which then creates that weak point that can assist in failure. The other factor that that burying trees too deeply affects is water access. So additional soil overlaying that root system can actually limit water availability in the root zone because it basically gets trapped in that soil and doesn't make it to where that root system actually is further down. And this can really stress newly planted trees, especially before they've had a chance to go out and explore the soil for soil moisture, or again, go up where there may have better access to soil. And this is a really critical piece for us here in the Intermountain West because at least where I am here in Boise, we live in the very edge of the Great Basin sagebrush steppe. So we're living here in the very edge of that desert ecosystem. Our native trees are really tough trees like netleaf hackberry that find crevices of boulders and rocks and things like that in our foothills, and they chase water from there. So they're very slow growing trees and are just really super tough trees. Or we have trees that grow along the river, like our cottonwoods, that are river, riparian adapted species. So that's what we're, naturally sort of dealing with. You have to supplemental irrigate trees in this area to help them survive. And you are shooting yourself in the foot if you bury trees too deeply because that water may not even get to that root ball of that tree that you just buried. That is way worse with something called a mulch volcano. I have a picture of that coming up. And it's worse with compacted soil, which is often an issue in the urban environment where trees will be installed and then that area around that root system will be heavily compacted. Maybe because that topsoil was, removed, and what you're actually dealing with then is subsoil, that lower B soil horizon that just naturally has more clay content, so it has a little bit higher, a bulk density or compaction already, or it might be like actually physically compacted by machinery, foot traffic, just you name it, whatever is going on in that area. So trees are, the odds are stacked a lot of the times against our trees, but we can do a lot to help them, especially at this critical juncture when we're doing planting. So just to kind of sum up a couple of the facts we just looked at here. When trees are planted too deeply, they can develop stem girdling roots, which can limit phloem and xylem transport, so water and nutrient uptake. You can see fewer and deeper structural roots, so those that ascend at steep angles and have those weaker hinge points that are closer into the trunk. And you can also see the trees develop drought stress. And from again that additional swale above that root ball, preventing that water from reaching the roots. And this is not necessarily new. We've been looking at soil oxygen in the root zone of established trees since the 1960s. But it is something that is still an issue today. I think the first thing that I do when I go into a site visit is I um, we'll look at that root system to see, is the tree planted too deeply? Are there any stem girdling roots? And then back up and kind of look at the canopy and kind of put two and two together there. More pictures here of stem girdling roots and how they can be removed over time. Um, how you do this, why you do this, and when you do this, all of these things are uh, very important to study and do carefully, because you can take a lot more root mass than the tree is ready for, especially in some of our older trees. So there's a real art and a real science to root collar excavation and removal. I wanted to give this example here. This was a red bud. I know some folks in the industry that know these trees as dead buds. Unfortunately, they can be a little bit sensitive, at least in our area here. But this tree was set up for failure from the get-go because it had this root system that was had many encircling and some stem girdling roots there. And you can see in this photo right up here sort of where the tree was buried, and then where it really should have been planted, which was like all the way kind of back down here. Like this was actually the root flare, and that's what you really want visible after you plant a tree, is this area here called the root flare, where the trunk system gradually declines into the soil, not like a pencil in the dirt or a power pole or something like that. And if you squint at this picture, you can kind of almost see the container that the tree was planted in. So go back one, kind of see the potentially the container size of the tree was planted in. And there has been a lot, there have been some studies that have looked at um, when trees are transplanted or uppotted into higher, larger size containers, if that timing isn't done properly, those containers can actually create again that circling roots or those hinge points even, um, uh, when they're potted up from different sized containers at the nursery. So even before it gets to the planting phase, that containerized system and the process there can actually create weak points in the tree that can cause issues later on. So this was a study that was done last year that looked at uh, the quality of containerized trees, since that's a large part of where the industry is going or has gone, for shipping purposes for lots of reasons. We're using containerized trees rather than balled and burlap trees, et cetera. So we're looking here on the left, we've got a bad quality container tree. So we have excess soil above that root flare that isn't visible. We have girdling roots, wrapping around that stem. We might have some sort of issue with the bark above that, bark infection. You'll see like the cracking of the bark that might indicate a canker or something like that. And then we've got circling roots that are really going around and around, especially down at the bottom of the tree. And they're larger roots, but they're fewer roots. And when we look at good quality container stock, we see nice structural roots, but a dense root system with lots of fine roots near the side of the container, not these large chunky roots that are sort of wrapping around the outside of the container. And if you want to learn more about this study, put the name there. But there's also this amazing resource if you're growing trees called the American Standard for Nursery Stock, the ANSI Z60.2 was just updated last year. This has been a document that was created in the 1920s to help nursery stock producers, growers, wholesalers, installers all get on the same page about the kind of stock that we want to be putting out into our urban environment, and how do we do that based on the latest available science. So this was just updated recently, and you can get a copy for free through American Hort right there. So I'll pause just for a second so that you can capture that QR code if you would like to. But this document goes over lots and lots and lots of details around nursery stock growing. How do you measure caliper? How do you do this? How do you do that? And provide some good standards. But in those standards, it does talk about planting depth and girdling roots, things like that. So important piece of literature there. Um, Next here, so let's talk about how we're actually going to go through the planting process to help um, us avoid planting trees too deeply, and what are we doing based on the latest science to help trees survive when we're planting them. So there's one, this is not a tree here, but a shrub, but this is a leatherleaf viburnum. Very similar principles are going to apply to our woody shrubs as to our trees. This was a tree that was did have a lot of those circling roots right here, at the bottom here. And through root shaving, we removed a number of roots there. Gary Morton of the Morton Arboretum's research has shown that you can take around like a quarter of the root system off at the planting stage, and that especially if those root systems, those roots that you're taking off are smaller roots, they will regenerate more quickly, and that won't provide as much stress to the tree. So this is a stressful process for sure, but so is having encircling and girdling roots that ultimately doom the tree. You also want to be able to see the root flare. So again, whether you're planting a tree or a shrub, you want to be able to see that gradual um, uh, decline, decline of the root system into the soil. So the topmost root, you want that to be slightly visible as you plant the tree. There are other compounding factors here, so we're going to walk through the planting process here in a minute. But death by plastic, twine left on the root ball will eventually girdle trees. So it does not break down in the environment, that twine, that synthetic rope, if you will. Remove the twine. You want to remove any treated burlap, synthetic burlap, and wire baskets from the upper part of the tree. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more. But just look at what damage that twine did to this poor tree here. And it's sending up these epicormic shoots right here, kind of a sign of stress that the tree is reaching out for help in a way when you see these roots here, or sorry, shoots here down at the base. Almost looks like it was cutting in, and maybe even there was a borer active potentially there as well. But either way, twine left on the root ball is no good. Landscape fabric can also act like twine and girdle the tree by being placed too close, being wrapped too close around the root system. And this is not a talk about landscape fabric. I know there are many feelings around the use of or not using landscape fabric. But at the very least, don't, wrap them right around trees, because as the tree grows, again, going to increase in diameter, and that fabric can place pressure on the trunk flare or trunk of the tree. Keep it 2 to 3 feet away from newly planted trees. Again, for if nothing else, but for water access as the tree's getting established. Other situations can look like this: death by netafim, which is a drip irrigation system. Be mindful of how you're setting up the irrigation system early on. Again, remember, tree roots grow out 1 to 2 times the height of the tree. So where you actually need to be irrigating is often much further out. That irrigation needs to be on the root ball initially in that first year, 2 years of the tree, but then you really need to start to bring it out away from that trunk and further out into the drip line, critical root zone, and beyond as the tree grows several feet per year in terms of its root mass. So how do we plant a tree? So these next several slides, I'm taking a lot of information from Ed Gilman's instructional videos. I have a link to those at the end here. They are highly worth watching. He goes into depth about planting trees, but also tree root systems and what they are, and diagnosing tree issues. So it's a really great resource there. So I want to give that a shout out. We start by creating a planting hole 1.5 to 2 times the size of the root ball. Here in the Treasure Valley, we have some really heavily compacted soils in certain areas, and so you may even need to expand out to 3 times the size of the root ball. But you want that planting hole to be shallow and wide. You may need to do a little bit of pruning here at this time as well, taking out any codominant stems, codominant leaders, things like that. But you want that root ball to be resting on compacted soil, not heavily compacted. You don't need to go in there with like a big, tamper or something like that. You really can just go in with your feet and kind of gently tamp the backfill soil in around the base. So that the tree doesn't settle. Because again, we're trying to prevent trees from being buried too deep. We want to be able to see the root flare, so we want to make sure that that soil isn't going to settle directly underneath the root ball. So that top root flare should be at the same level or as the top of the soil, or within 2 inches by the A300 standards. So find that root flare, find that topmost root. It's not going to be some tiny little squiggly adventitious root. It's going to be, it'll look like a nice continuation of that root flare down into the soil. You may need to dig down. You may need to dig down. I've planted trees where the root flare was 8 inches down. So you may need to dig down quite a ways to be able to actually find that root flare. And you want to take any soil or those little tiny kind of squiggly adventitious roots above that root flare. You want to take those off and dispose of them, so that soil doesn't sit above where that root flare actually needs to be. Measure the depths of the root ball, so you can look at the depth of the root ball and adjust the hole to be that deep. Trees can really easily settle deeper than they were planted, so you might want to plant a little bit high potentially. And at this time, this is a great moment to remove any girdling roots, or roots that might become girdling roots, so those encircling roots. And imagine that as the trunk diameter increases, what is it going to interact with in that's there present in that root ball? When is an encircling root going to become a girdling root in the tree's life cycle? And sometimes, again, the symptoms of this, that canopy dieback, flagging, stress, isn't going to show up until 10 to 15 years down the road, when that trunk diameter increases, that root diameter increases, and then they start interacting with one another and that compression happens. Cut the burlap and basket. So this is controversial in terms of cutting the basket, how you cut the basket, if you should cut the basket at all, how much, all of those things. The wire basket is hot topic in the world of arboriculture. But in general, for sure, things that you want to do: remove the twine and anything else synthetic, any grow bags, etc. Don't leave those in, especially synthetic burlap, things like that. And even just normal burlap breaks down pretty slowly here in the Intermountain West. We don't have the weather of other places in the country, so you want to at least take that off the top. The general rule of thumb from folks like Gary Watson is to take the top 2/3 of the wire basket off. There's different ways to do this too. So one way to do it is to tip the tree on its side before you plant. Remove the bottom of the basket and then you'll still have sort of the outside ring around the tree, move it in place, and then cut one side of the basket, and then you can kind of slide the rest of it off pretty cleanly. So sometimes that works and is a good way to just do it quickly as well. Or you can cut the top um, layer of the top tier of wire as well. But really important to remove synthetic materials, burlap, twine, etc. Backfill with native soil. So you can see this happen a lot with folks that will amend their planting hole with compost. Compost is great. I teach about compost all the time. It's a wonderful resource, but you want to be really careful with amending that planting hole, especially with just solid compost, because as the compost gets used up by the microbes in the soil, it goes down, right? So it disappears. And breaks down, decomposes. So that creates a bathtub effect, and then all of a sudden your tree is back to being, lower in grade than the soil around it. In general, you don't need to use any other amendments. Most of the research around a lot of those additional amendments um, doesn't show that there's significant improvement in the health or longevity of the tree. I think there's a lot more studies that need to be done in that area um, because we're always coming up with kind of new things that we can add to planting holes. If you're going to use compost, which I do recommend a lot in our area here with many of our clay soils, amend the entire critical root zone. So amend that area far out away from the planting hole, and don't just amend that planting hole. That's a really critical piece. I was going to say something else here, and I don't remember what it was. You can berm up the soil a little bit on the outside of the root ball, right on the outside of the root ball, and then that kind of helps just create that funnel for water, irrigation, rain, etc., to be directed to the root ball. Um, the other piece is mulch. So if you're going to use mulch, mulch away from the root ball. You don't want to stack a bunch of mulch on top of the root ball. No volcano mulches. We're not interested in volcano mulches. They have been shown time and time again to kill trees or at least stress them out greatly. So do not do not mulch right around the root flare. Um, really lightly mulch over a thin layer over the root ball is fine. But if you're going to put mulch down, use that, away from the root ball and about 2 to 4 inches. Here, usually around 4 inches helps to reduce weeds primarily is the function there, and then keeps a little bit of moisture in the soil as well around that root ball. But too much mulch right on top of the root ball will just suppress water. It won't allow it to actually get in from the top to the root ball. If staking is necessary, stake on 2 sides and remove those stakes after 1 year. So not just one crossbar stake, but 2 stakes driven into the ground. There's lots of different options here in terms of how you do this and where the stakes are held. But in general, we want 2 stakes on either side, not one crossbar in the middle. And remove encroaching grasses and maintain that area around the tree. So make sure that the grasses aren't growing in and around that trunk system, because that can hide issues happening around the trunk when you're using a string trimmer near that trunk or a mower near that tree to get those grasses down. You might also, mower blight hit that trunk, and then that creates a place for injury for pests and diseases and things like that. And finally, with many trees, wrap it up. So you can actually use tree wrap or paint to prevent something called winter injury, which is where the sun will heat up the southwest side of young tree bark, and it'll essentially like lose its dormancy in the wintertime. And when the temperature goes down suddenly from, beautiful day like today down to whatever it's going to get to at night, those cells can freeze and damage. And invite again pests and diseases. And really, this is kind of the ending thoughts here is that when we set our trees up for success, we are safeguarding them against something called the tree mortality spiral, which is just one of those unfortunate things that we see so often with trees in the urban environment is that they enter into the spiral and can't get out. So Jerry Franklin and others adapted this disease decline spiral into this tree mortality spiral, and we look at these series of sequential events that added on top of one another, so cumulative impacts that result in tree decline and death. And so it's not one of these individual factors that really causes the tree decline. It's the combination of all of these factors that send the tree into uh, a place where they can't remedy the issue. Trees do have abilities, they have an immune system just like us. It doesn't work the same as ours does, but it does fight back against pests and diseases. And they only have so many limited resources where they can spend their energy. And just like us, when we get stressed, we get sick. Trees and plants are the same way. When they get stressed by all these different factors, they get sick. So let's say the tree in this example is getting stressed because it has limited water and nutrient uptake. Maybe it was planted too deeply. And so we see again that relationship with the root system being compromised because of that planting depth. Maybe it's fighting against compacted soils. Maybe it's been injured somehow. So it's now using its energy to seal up over that wound. Maybe it's experiencing extreme heat. And so it's using resources to try to conduct transpiration and cool itself off. And because of those compounded stressors, we might see continued decline because those stressors are signals. So I'm an entomologist. Insects can very much pick up on a stressed tree. They do it in lots of different ways. Some do it visually, some do it through scent. Um, uh, and they can pick up on that stress that the tree is putting out. And go, oh, this is a weak tree. It can't fight back against me that well. So I'm going to, start boring into the tree. Maybe I'll bring all of my buddies with me and continue to decline and compromise that tree. Diseases can do something similar as well, where they're really the secondary source of stress, not the primary source of stress. And many times, when we're going out and we're diagnosing issues, we can go, oh, yeah, this tree does have XYZ borer or disease. Um, and you might think, oh, okay, great, I'll apply a fungicide or I will do whatever I need to do to get rid of that insect. But the initial factor that actually started to compound and cause that tree decline was something that could have been fixed at planting, could have been remedied initially at planting. So we want to try to remediate that if possible. Um, that continued decline, if that stress isn't um, either ameliorated by the tree or by us, by our practices, that's when we start to see tree death or limb failure. How do we prevent these things? Well, we can plant trees properly. We can use tools in our toolbox like the ONSI, American National Standards Institute's A300 tree care series, and guide the management of our trees in a way that is based, again, on science and expertise and this long-term stewardship. When you're thinking about managing trees, you're thinking 50 to 100 years in the future, not in terms of what's going to happen tomorrow. And we really need to be using that long-term forward thinking in addition to relying on experience and research in order to guide the care of our urban canopies. Here's the link that I promised from Dr. Ed Gilman. Great video series if you want to dive into tree care and management. He goes more in depth than I did today on planting practices and things like that. I've got some sources here for your viewing pleasure. Just a few light reads there. Could recommend many more books on trees. You can see I'm a book nerd. So just reach out if you have any questions there. And I'll end on this. We finally found the square root of the tree.